welcome to the Talk Sense Show. I'm here, Prim, and I have a very special guest out of the US today with me. Her name is Antonia, and she's got a law firm out of New York. Welcome to Dubai.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Could you tell us a little bit what kind of activities you are pursuing out of the US?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a lawyer by background. I've worked in the financial space, investment advisory side of the business for over 15 years now. I have a consulting firm right now focusing on strategic advisory work and also work providing services to traditional financial services like hedge funds and investment advisors, as well as the more disruptive part of the market, fintech, blockchain companies staying within the space.
All right. So blockchain is definitely something which is evolving very fast, and I believe that the regulations part, but also the compliance side, there is a lot of things to do. What is your experience now in the US working with blockchain companies specifically?
So I think it's a very exciting space to be in, and the fact that it was very uncertain as a couple of years ago drew me into it, because my background is in regulatory compliance, as I mentioned, and the regulations were not very certain in the US, and I can talk about that a little bit more later on because of the way the markets are structured and agencies involved and state versus federal regulations. So as the market is becoming a little more mature, and even though there is no formal rulemaking from the side of the majority of the regulatory bodies that I can mention as well, there is a lot of guidance. So there is a lot more expectations from the regulators, and we've reached the point where companies should be aware of the status.
So, I mean, the US is the largest capital market in the world.
Mm-hmm.
US is also known for the SEC. When it comes to enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
SEC has been one of those authorities worldwide
Mm-hmm.
to go behind projects or for that matter clients
Mm-hmm.
who have not applied the rules accordingly.
Yes.
So I mean, it's one of those where when you're going to, and this is what I've heard from other experiences, basically when you go against the SEC or have a litigation case
Mm-hmm.
against one of these like the SEC, then you are actually kind of like 2 steps behind, because they are so big and powerful going forward in these kind of things. Now, if you look at digital securities in specific, one of the things which has been happening, if you want to do an IPO in the US, the number of IPOs have decreased over the years because of the complexity. People say that it's very costly to do an IPO, so you have $1 billion plus kind of companies who are trying to do it. What do you think that digital securities will bring on the table going forward?
So before we go forward, let's just take a step back.
Sure.
A couple of years ago. If you remember the ICO craze of 2016 and 2017, and speaking about regulatory action, we know that the majority of these ICOs were fraudulent. So in the US, the regulators came after those fraudulent ICOs because their primary function is to protect investors and also the integrity of the financial markets. In fact, they created a website, a mock ICO website, as a way of educating investors on what to look for. It's a pretty cool website. You can go, even now it's active. It's called How It Coins, and you can click through it, and it takes you to various other sites, and ultimately to the investor.gov website, which is the SEC's public site for educating investors. So they identify red flags such as celebrity endorsements, which is very popular for fraudulent ICOs, or claims that the companies have registered with either the SECs or maybe other regulatory bodies. So that's just one tool. You mentioned enforcement. That's another tool. In fact, a couple of years ago, the SEC created the cyber unit within the Division of Enforcement to go after companies. I believe the distributed ledger technology was part of the cyber security component, where they're focusing on making sure that fraud is reduced from a cybersecurity perspective, and there have been a number of enforcement cases in that space as well.
Yes, I mean, wherever U.S. investors have invested in, for example, ICOs, you know, they really went behind it to look at it. At least the bigger project, because of course there were like so many projects in the ICO craze, but you know, the bigger names which were there, you know, they have been looking into it deeply going forward.
Even now, even for the past 12 months, they've been very, very active, the Division of Enforcement. So there are many enforcement cases, you know, Kik being one of the bigger ones that you I'm sure you know, and the people who would be watching this probably would know as well. It's been a number of them have come out, so including Telegram is the most recent.
Yeah, of course, Telegram is also part of it. But if you look at it, right, is it really the enforcement? If you look at it, is it really because they have said that it was a utility token, but apparently under the the SEC rules, it's seen as a security? Is that the reason?
So the way the SEC is approaching this is they're not creating a new regulatory framework similar to what smaller jurisdictions are doing, where there is more flexibility to kind of say, okay, how can we approach the space, and how can we attract more companies? So in the U.S. they're looking at something called the Howey test, which is a test, which is a Supreme Court a test from 1946. It's a precedent, and basically that's the test for an investment contract, and that's the test for what establishes a security. So once there is a determination that something is a security, then you have to register it according to applicable laws, unless of course there is an exemption that might be applicable, such as a private placement, Reg T and Reg S.
Got it.
And in fact, the SEC came up this past year. They've come up with a couple of joint statements. One was, I believe, in March, together with FINRA, with the SEC and FINRA, a joint statement, the discussion around the custody issue for broker-dealers, and then more recently there was a joint statement between among the SEC, FinCEN, and CFTC, again discussing digital assets. So it seems that there is no formal rulemaking, but a lot of guidance. So companies now know what to expect. Another thing is a framework from the SEC's FinHub, which is the FinHub is a site where investors can go. I'm sorry, not investors, but projects or companies in the blockchain space can go and informally ask questions and get feedback
from it.
Yes.
Can it be compared to a sandbox, or is that totally different?
I would maybe in a way. I think in a sandbox you can kind of create the project.
Yes.
You can work on it. You have a little bit more support. This is to get feedback on whether or not you're moving in the right direction, or maybe you may be facing some issues in the future in terms of whether or not the security the token needs to be registered.
Got it. So the regulator is kind of like, if you proactively as a project do not know where you stand, you can go and basically test it with the regulator and
exactly.
get an opinion basically based upon that, what to do. Registration or not? I mean,
well, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure if they'll advise you on that. So it's not formal opinion. You get that through a no action letter. This is more of an informal discussion. So they get to know the firm, they get to know the business plan, the people behind the project. So you start to create a dialogue.
Okay, so we're having a cup of coffee with the regulator.
you can, yes, in a way, yes. And I actually was involved with a company that decided to utilize this process. They wanted to be more proactive. Not everyone is proactive, and in fact, one of the SEC's directors in an event expressed disappointment that not more companies are not utilizing this function more.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, there will be a lot of questions, especially when you're doing, projects which, in the end will backfire you. It's always good to be proactive in that matter. Now, to clarify on if I do register or not register, is it really about the fees which are involved, basically, that it's holding back a project to do so, or is it more of obligations we have to do as a project to do? I mean, look at me. I'm a very lazy person in the end. So for me to do all extra paperwork is like, no, I don't want to do that.
Well, I think it's a complex question, and the answer is even more complex.
Oops.
Because then you have to do an analysis first on a federal level, and you primarily will be dealing with the SEC. So you have to go through that analysis on whether or not the token or however else you call it, right? You may call it a digital asset, a security token, regardless of what you call it, that thing, is it ultimately a security which requires to be registered? Then, but then we may be talking about registration as an exchange, for instance.
Okay.
So that's a completely different topic. If you, for instance, are conducting business in a jurisdiction such as New York, which is more on the restrictive side, with the BIT license, that's a regulatory framework for getting a license to be able to do business in the state of New York, whether you're doing business with residents, residents of the state or of the state itself. You need to qualify and need to get approved by the New York regulator, which is the Department of Financial Services.
Okay. So because this is a burning question I always had, because at times, people come up that Wyoming is a better state to do business with, or maybe what's the other state again? Arizona might be a better state to work in. But is it really true that in the United States, if you're going to have some kind of national license, you have to do 57 times the application?
It depends. Yes, for certain things. Now, there is something called notice filings. I mean, that applies more on the investment advisory side. But normally, yes, you have to apply. You have to make sure that each state you're okay to
operate.
You meet the requirements for that specific state. And there is a way to. There is a form on the BD side and on the investment advisory side that can be checked off. But normally, there's state laws that are called the blue sky laws.
Okay.
That may be different from some of the federal regulations. So
all right.
that adds to the complexity of the environment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are out of New York, so
yes, I'm based in New York City.
And New York is supposed to be one of the tougher ones to get through.
Yes.
Is that because of Wall Street, or is there any other reason for that as well?
Well, yes. I mean, it's the biggest financial market, right, in the U.S. and Also, a lot of people are interested in conducting business and getting close to investors in New York. But also I mentioned the Department of Financial Services with the BIT license, so that's on the more restrictive side, right? And up until, I want to say 1 or 2 weeks ago, there were about only 23 companies being approved for the BIT license.
Okay.
And that since the regulation became effective in 2015. So for the last 4 years now.
Yes.
So it's a long process. That's if you want to operate as an exchange, for example, in New York.
Yeah.
And many companies, when the framework became effective, left New York. That was called the BIT exodus, because all of these companies running exchanges had to either apply for the license, which meant they had to develop a very robust compliance program with a cybersecurity component, AML, privacy policies and procedures, and then in addition the team needed to be vetted as well with fingerprinting. So it's a very burdensome process for say a small startup.
Got it. Of course, that can be definitely very, very burdensome going forward. And I think also some people worked on this Rec CF, right? The crowdfunding part, to make it a little bit easier, but still, I feel there is a lot of paperwork to be done.
Yes, a lot.
So let's start off with digital securities, right? I mean, one of the things people are trying to do is that bigger companies are able to do an IPO. Just now here, recently last week, we had Saudi Aramco basically doing a huge IPO where they raised billions of dollars, but more importantly, they were valued at $1.78 trillion, which is like the biggest IPO ever. But more importantly, smaller companies have been kind of left out in this whole equation to do an IPO, to do a capital raise for that matter, going forward. Do you believe that other ATSs, as they call it in the US, like Open Circle and T0, are able to help doing a capital raise for small and medium-sized companies?
So I think that's a market that seems to be developing, because there are a number of companies that are working in this space with the primary and maybe secondary trading, making it available, utilizing disruptive technology, blockchain and then smart contracts, and allowing private companies to be able to trade. So I think that's one possibility. As you mentioned, ATS, which is alternative trading systems, and they still have to go through the process of registration. So it's not that they're left out of the regulatory space. They have to register with FINRA, become a member of FINRA, and then get approved for an ATS through the SEC. So it's still a process. It's not something. So it's a process. It involves a lot of development, a lot of documentation, development of internal policies and procedures, also interviews with the regulators. So it takes a while to be up and running.
Got it. So that makes the whole process very long and stringy, and hopefully by the use of digital securities, I'm not saying that the paperwork will be less, because you always will be needing a securities lawyer to help you out in doing all the filings, but more importantly is the fact that once you're able to list yourself, right, and do a capital raise of only, let's say, $20 million versus billions of dollars, which the bigger companies are doing, it becomes more tangible in that matter.
Yes, it's more accessible for smaller companies.
Absolutely, and as they say, at least in Europe, it's like this: like the small and medium enterprises are basically the oil of the economy. If they are doing well, they create jobs, they create momentum, then the whole economy starts flourishing out of there. And I believe that in the US, it's of course a lot of big giants which are there, but also the small and medium sized companies are basically the oil to fuel the growth going forward.
Sure, so that provides access to the markets for them and to investors, absolutely.
Absolutely. And in the end, the investor needs to be also protected. So it's a good way that protection is then done through these ATSs going forward, and able to create it. Now, I would like to know a little bit more on the compliance side, basically.
Sure.
So there are a number of, I think, thousands of broker dealers in the US registered out of there, and they work with different authorities, maybe FINRA or, for that matter, SEC. But the whole idea is that how does this compliance side actually work for them in their benefit?
Okay, so I mean, even if you're, regardless of, if you look at the traditional space for broker dealers and investment advisors, they have to have a compliance program because there are current rules and regulations that are requiring the companies to have that, including a chief compliance officer, and it's a very involved process with reporting for certain aspects. If you get into the investment advisor, investment companies such as mutual funds or investment advisors. So if you involve securities or digital assets, but you still follow the rules and regulations of, say, a broker dealer, and you have to go through a registration with FINRA, you still need to meet those requirements. So you still need to develop a compliance program, written supervisory procedures. You have to have an AML program. You have to have all of the components of a regular compliance program, very similar to the BIT license that I mentioned.
All these services you provide as well, right?
Well, no, I mean, bigger shops can handle a lot of that work, but I can help companies through many of these processes, including drafting policies and procedures and advising them on what's required.
Got it. So if you look at setting up a company in the US versus setting up a company here, for example, in Dubai, right? So here in Dubai, I just mentioned, we are here in the DIFC.
Yes, right around us.
Absolutely. So, and the Dubai International Financial Center is basically the place where financial companies come to do business worldwide. This is a free zone, like there are plenty of free zones in the UAE. I think there are 42 free zones in total, each dedicated to different kind of thing. You have like a media city or a health city where only health companies sit together and operate and get benefits out of that. But more importantly is the fact that sitting out of here, we're able to work worldwide. How complex is it to do business in the US when it comes to following regulations in the space of setting up a company and operating it?
I think it's a little bit more complex because in terms of trying to figure it out and understand who the players are, whether or not you want to, first you need to pick a state, right? So you can, Delaware is a very popular state for...
You're just reading my mind right now. I was about to say Delaware.
Yes, it's one of the most popular states for setting up a corporate entity. New York as well. Delaware has different benefits for that. It's very popular. And then on top of that, you have what we were just talking about, the regulatory bodies that may be, depending on the business you're in, what part of the ecosystem, you may have, be required to register with the SEC, with FINRA as a broker-dealer, with the CFTC. Then you have FinCEN as well that may be involved. So there are a number of different players. And if you're operating as an exchange out of New York, we've been talking about the BIT license with the DFS. So there is a multitude of entities, government agencies that may be involved.
Yes.
And
so
you have to be aware of that.
I'm very much aware because I used to live actually for 2 years in New York and was a broker myself. So, I'm very much aware that there was continuous training basically going on. Although I had a Series 7 and a 63 to be operational as a broker, more importantly, there was continuous training going on. If you compare here to the Middle East, for example, or specifically Dubai, till recent basically, and then I'm talking 10 years only, it was, these kind of accreditation was not needed. And it's basically that they look into your blue eyes and say, okay, this guy is going to do good for the company or for us. But nowadays, continuous education is really part of everything, and they're giving training out of here to help us to come to that kind of minimum knowledge for everyone within the company who is dealing with clients going forward. I mean, being an advisory firm or a broker dealer, the whole thing is this, that you have to have minimum kind of understanding of certain laws. Might be security, so otherwise, and how to deal with the client, going forward. So there's still a lot of things to learn from what's going on in mainland, in the US for that matter, because if you deal here in the free zone, but then if you just across the street go to Sheikh Zayed Road, indeed, you have to work with, for example, the Securities and Commodities Authority, ESCA, to where their laws apply for retail investors going forward. So there's a lot of things happening, and I believe that we're going more towards what's happening in US, as I said before, it's one of the biggest capital markets. It's the biggest capital market. It's not one of the biggest capital market for sure, where we learn basically how things can be implemented accordingly out of here.
And also, because it's such a big market, it has a very established infrastructure, right? So it's with smaller jurisdictions, especially as we're talking about digital assets, and they can very swiftly come up with new rules and regulations and new framework to draw more companies into those jurisdictions. In the US, it's established and there are a lot of players involved, so it's very difficult to change things. Plus, the regulators now are providing a lot more guidance, and it feels like it's maturing from that aspect.
Angle. All right.
From that
so
angle, yes.
I wanted to ask you about smart contracts.
I'm not a techie, I have to say I'm not a techie.
Well, a lot of lawyers have tried actually to do work on smart contracts and becoming solidity programmers. I mean, stick to your work, man, or woman. We pay you a lot for doing law work, which is necessary to do, set up the contracts and set up everything. But more importantly is the fact that what do you think? Do lawyers need to know solidity, for example? Because Ethereum is used everywhere nowadays, or mostly, let's put it this way, and the language which is used up there is solidity. Do you feel that lawyers should learn something about
programming? I probably not to that extent. I mean, there now a lot of law firms they have special groups and divisions that specialize obviously on distributed ledger technologies or crypto or blockchain. Smart contracts are utilized for many of these projects. So yes, lawyers should have the understanding of the terms, some of the technical terms involved, and what blockchain and cryptography mean, and kind of the framework that's supporting all of these technologies, so that they can translate that into help clients, but they need to have the knowledge, a little bit of the technical knowledge to kind of being able to comfortably use the terms.
So I mean, I'm willing to write this article basically, how smart is a smart contract, because in the end it's all about statements. If this happens, then that happens. If this happens, then that. And then that's basically, if you look in a contract, for example, if I do not get into milestone number 2, then I do not get a payout for what it is, right? I mean, that's like in the contract, you would put these if statements to solidify what the outcome will be. So, you know, let's see how this is going to roll. But definitely, it's very interesting to see how smart contracts are going to be used to automate basically part of that payout system when it comes to a dividend or when it comes to anything else based upon criteria. Me being a non-US citizen, am I allowed to, you know, trade this security, for example, right?
Oh, okay. So this is a very interesting point because, say for instance, companies are aware of that because as part of you mentioned, you know, being a non-US citizen. So if you were to become a client of a company that deals with digital assets and security tokens in the US, you have to be onboarded. So as part of the onboarding process, you have to provide information about your identity, background,
KYC,
AML, background checks. If you're an accredited investor, if the company is focusing on doing business with, you know, the accredited investors, you have to be qualified. So you have to, they have to vet you as such. So there is a process. I mean, that involves smart contracts and uploading documents and then making sure that whether they're viewed manually or if it's the system is making an assessment before you move on to the next step of the approval process as part of the onboarding, background checks and AML. So it's smart contracts are being used during that process as well.
Got it. So I mean, before I let you go, when are you coming back to Dubai again?
As soon as I can. I loved it. It's my first visit to Dubai. I'm learning so much about. I attended the blockchain Congress organized by the Agora Group. And also I was invited to a couple of other events while I'm here, and also this interview with you. So I'd love to come back. It's an amazing city with a lot of dynamic things happening in different parts of not only the digital assets ecosystem, but in every other part of, you know, every other industry. So
True. I mean,
it's amazing to come back.
Just to touch on a little bit, as you know, Brexit is happening in Great Britain, in the UK, but we see a lot of activity basically happening here in the DIFC itself, that a lot of UK companies are looking to open up a company out of here, for example. But the same thing is happening that in Luxembourg, right, which is in Europe, also one of those tax-friendly jurisdictions. You see a lot of companies coming into Europe, into Luxembourg, to set up shop going forward. Now, obviously, Brexit will not have an impact out of there, but you know, we see a lot of activity now in the last couple of months because of these, you know, turmoils in
the geopolitical events.
Absolutely happening out of there. So, you know, it's going to be an exciting time for sure. I would like to invite you next time again to come to our podcast
thank
and
you very much.
talk
about
what else is happening basically, because this although we are talking about laws which have been there for so many years, there's so much activity happening.
Yes,
it's in a very exciting space to be in.
It's very exciting space to be in, and I look forward to coming back.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Same up here. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you.